My name is Elaine Whitford, and I am 63 years old. If you had met me 5 years ago, you would have described me as a gentle creature of routine. I lived in a small coastal town, worked part-time at the library, cooked dinner at 6, and spent my evenings watching the tide roll in with a cup of chamomile tea. My husband, Daniel, and I had been married for almost 3 decades. We were not wealthy, but we were steady. Responsible. Predictable in the quiet way long marriages often are. Daniel and I had planned and saved for years to buy the house we now lived in, a modest but warm 2-story place with pale blue siding, a small garden, and windows that caught the afternoon light like they'd been designed for it. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. Every monthly mortgage payment had been deliberate, measured, and ours alone. If you had asked me back then whether I trusted my in-laws, would have said yes. Daniel's parents, Margaret and Howard, were the sort of people who cared deeply about their reputation. Always well-dressed, always perfectly polite in public, always eager to appear generous, even when their generosity took the shape of strings strong enough to tow a barge. I had learned early in my marriage that nothing from them came free, not even kindness. Still, we kept the peace. We attended their elaborate holiday dinners, complimented Margaret's oversalted casseroles, and nodded patiently while Howard retold the same stories about his imaginary glory days in real estate. That was the rhythm of my life. Quiet. Manageable. Predictable. Until, one Sunday afternoon, a neighbor approached me at the grocery store and said something that made my hands go cold, right there in the produce aisle between the pears and the plums. "Elaine," she said, leaning in as if sharing good gossip. "I heard your in-laws helped you and Daniel buy your house. That was generous of them." I blinked at her, confused. "Helped us buy it?" "Oh yes," she said. "Margaret mentioned it at church. She said you two could never have afforded such a nice place without them." She sounded proud of it. I stood there, trying to find my breath. My in-laws had helped us buy our home? Since when? I laughed it off with the neighbor, an awkward, brittle laugh that didn't quite sound like my own, but something in me shifted that day. A quiet click. A warning. A subtle disturbance in the waters of my otherwise calm life. Because I knew, with absolute certainty, that Daniel and I had paid for our home ourselves. Every payment. Every document signed. Every cent carefully saved. My in-laws hadn't contributed a single dollar. Yet they were telling people they had. And what began as a whisper became something far louder. Rumors drifted in from multiple directions: church friends, casual acquaintances, the couple who lived across the street. The story spread like wildfire. Margaret and Howard, it seemed, had cast themselves in the role of benevolent benefactors, swooping in to rescue their financially helpless son and his aging wife. I remember standing in my kitchen one evening, staring at the steam rising from a pot of soup, feeling something I rarely experienced: anger. Not the quick spark of irritation, but a slow, growing heat. I didn't know then just how far the lies had spread. I didn't know how deep the betrayal went. But I could feel it: something was coming. Something that would shatter the quiet predictability of my life. And I could feel, deep in my bones, that I would not be the same woman on the other side of it. I just didn't yet know the cost of uncovering the truth. I was about to discover that the rumor about the house was only the beginning, and the smallest of the lies my in-laws had been spreading for years. I had expected the gossip to fade on its own. Surely, I reasoned, it was just one of Margaret's habitual exaggerations. She loved embellishment the way some people loved collecting porcelain figurines, excessively, compulsively. It was easier to shrug off the comments than to confront her over them. But the situation escalated in a way I could never have predicted. 2 weeks after the incident in the grocery store, Daniel and I attended a barbecue hosted by his cousin's family. It was a warm, breezy afternoon, the kind that usually made me feel light and unburdened. Children were running around the yard, adults chatting beneath the shade of a maple tree, and the smell of grilled chicken drifted through the air. I had just taken a seat with a plate of potato salad when I overheard someone behind me say, "I still can't believe his parents paid for their whole down payment." Must be nice. My hand froze midair. Another voice chimed in, Margaret told me they basically bought the house. Said she and Howard didn't want Daniel stuck in a fixer-upper. Heat pulsed at my temples. Then someone laughed. I guess Elaine should be grateful. She married into money, after all. That was when I turned around. Slowly. Controlled. Excuse me, I said. What did you just say? They looked at each other, startled, then motioned toward Margaret, who stood across the yard speaking animatedly to a small group of relatives. One of the women said quietly, she said they took on most of the cost of your house. She mentioned they helped with your renovations too. Renovations? I almost laughed. Daniel and I had painted the entire house ourselves, on a budget, with discount paint from a local hardware store. Our renovations consisted of sanding cabinets until our hands cramped and replacing a broken mailbox. But before I could respond, I saw Margaret's gaze flick toward me across the yard. She smiled. A triumphant smile. A smile bursting with pride at the story she'd constructed. A smile that told me she enjoyed being perceived as our savior. Something in me snapped. Daniel joined me moments later, holding 2 drinks. I pulled him aside and told him what I had overheard. He frowned, confused. She's not saying that, he insisted. Maybe people misunderstood. But they hadn't. And he knew it. I could see the truth flicker in his eyes, a small flash of discomfort he tried to bury. Talk to her, I said calmly but firmly. He refused. She's just being dramatic, he muttered. It's harmless. Harmless. That word lodged itself in me like a splinter. Because it was not harmless. Not anymore. But the true shock landed that evening when I discovered something that chilled me far more than gossip. After we returned home, I received a message from an old friend of mine, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. She wrote, I'm confused. Margaret told my sister that you couldn't pass the credit check for the mortgage, is that true? My body went cold. Cold the way seawater is cold when it rushes into your lungs. Because not only was it false, it was a deeply personal, deeply invasive lie. I called Daniel into the room. I held up the message. Tell me you didn't know she was saying this. He didn't answer. And in that silence, I felt something shift between us, something that would not entirely return to its old shape. The betrayal was no longer just gossip. It had become a full-blown character assassination. My privacy had been dragged into the open. My financial life had been twisted into a story. My dignity had been stripped for the sake of my in-laws' imagined philanthropy. And Daniel, my husband, had been watching it happen. I soon learned this wasn't simply Margaret's vanity, it was part of a long-standing pattern I had been blind to for years. When I first married Daniel, I had thought his parents were merely intense. Overly invested. Traditional in the suffocating way some families can be. But as I sat alone at the dining table that night, replaying the barbecue conversations, a dull ache settled into my chest. Because the puzzle pieces began falling into place, not gently, but with the unmistakable click of inevitability. I started to remember moments I had dismissed. Moments that now felt different. Like the time Margaret insisted on choosing our wedding china, even though I had already picked out a set Daniel and I both loved. When I protested, she had said, if we're paying, we're choosing. Except, she hadn't paid. Or the time she told her friends she had helped Daniel buy his first car when he was 26. I remembered Daniel avoiding my eyes when I questioned him about it. I remembered him shrugging, saying it was easier to let her talk. Or the time she brought a group of church ladies into my home for an unannounced tour, as if the house were hers to show off. All these moments had seemed harmless once. Small irritations. Eccentricities. But I began to see the pattern. The pattern of ownership. Of manipulation. Of rewriting reality to elevate themselves. I had been tolerating it for years without truly understanding what it meant. Daniel, unfortunately, had been raised to believe this behavior was normal. To him, his parents' need for control wasn't toxic, it was simply how they are. He had spent his whole life caving to their demands to keep the peace. And now I realized, tolerating a river of small lies had led to this ocean of deceit. After the barbecue, I tried, gently, to talk to Daniel about addressing the rumors. His shoulders sagged, his voice weary. "Elaine, it doesn't matter what they say. Let it go. Let it go." I stared at the man I had built my life beside for 3 decades and felt a quiet, heavy grief. Because he didn't understand what mattered to me, and maybe he never had. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't about credit. It was about integrity. It was about someone rewriting the truth of my life, and expecting me to stay silent while they did it. I thought back to my own parents, both long past, who had worked tirelessly to instill in me a sense of dignity, self-respect, and responsibility. They would never have wanted me to accept someone using lies to diminish my worth. That night, I sat up in bed long after Daniel fell asleep. The quiet hum of the ceiling fan filled the room. And then a question drifted into my mind. If Margaret and Howard were willing to lie this boldly in public, what else were they lying about? The thought made my stomach sink. Because I realized there was only one way to find out. I would have to investigate. Not with shouting. Not with confrontation. But with documentation. And I knew exactly where I needed to begin, the financial record of our home. The next morning, I opened our old mortgage documents, and what I found hinted at something far worse than gossip. I started with the mortgage binder stored in the fireproof safe beneath our bed. I pulled it out early the next morning while Daniel was still asleep, setting it carefully on the dining table like a sacred relic. The binder held everything: closing documents, the appraisal, the loan approval, all of it. I flipped through the pages meticulously. And the more I looked, the angrier I became. Every signature was ours. Every check was ours. Every document proved, unequivocally, that no one else had contributed a single dollar. Yet something else caught my attention. At the time we bought the house, Daniel had insisted on handling the communication with the mortgage broker. I hadn't questioned it, he had worked in finance for years, and I trusted him. But as I scanned the email printouts included in the binder, I noticed that one piece was missing. The down payment transfer confirmation. It wasn't in the binder. It wasn't in the safe. It wasn't in our shared email. It was gone. And something about that absence felt intentional. I went straight to the online banking portal. Most banks archived statements for years, and I prayed ours did. After a few anxious clicks, I exhaled in relief. It was all there. I pulled up the statement from the month we made the down payment. And there it was. The full transfer. From our joint savings account. Signed by both Daniel and me. Clear as daylight. I downloaded it, printed it, and placed it carefully into a new folder. But as I combed through the statement, another detail made my breath hitch. There was a transfer, small, but suspicious, made around that same time. A transfer from Daniel to his parents. Not related to the house. Not matching any previous pattern. I stared at the number. It wasn't huge. But it was enough to raise questions. Why had he sent them money during the same week they now claimed to have funded our home? The realization crept in slowly, something had been happening behind my back. And if that was true, I needed to see more. So I printed every relevant statement. Every transfer. Every record from the time leading up to the house purchase. Then, I began cataloging the lies. Rumor by rumor. Claim by claim. Statement by statement. I documented everything meticulously: dates, witnesses, context. My training as a former administrative assistant kicked in. Years of dealing with paperwork, audits, and record-keeping had prepared me for this moment more than anything else in my life. By afternoon, my dining table looked like a crime lab. When Daniel entered the room and saw the papers, his face paled. "Elaine," he said. What are you doing? I lifted my eyes to him, calm but firm. Finding the truth. He swallowed, running a hand through his hair. You're blowing this out of proportion. No, I said quietly. Your parents are lying about us. And I need to understand why. He didn't answer. Not directly. He only rubbed his temples, muttering, "This is going to cause problems." I stared at him. The problems were caused the moment your parents chose to lie. His silence was telling. Painful. Revealing. And that silence told me something else. He was hiding more. I sat back down, picked up my pen, and kept writing. Because this wasn't just about gossip anymore. This was about dismantling a lie so deeply rooted that most people already believed it. And to do that, I would need undeniable proof. The next discovery I made wasn't about the house, it was about Daniel himself, and it changed everything. The following day, while Daniel was at work, I continued digging. I searched through old documents, emails, and finances, not because I wanted to catch him doing something wrong, but because something felt off. And what I found confirmed that instinct. I discovered an email exchange between Daniel and his parents dated just a week before the house purchase. It wasn't in the binder, it was backed up in one of his old cloud accounts, accessible from our shared desktop because he'd once used it for joint scheduling. The email was simple, but devastating in what it implied. Daniel had written, "We can't afford anything else. This is the best we can manage. Please don't make it worse." To which Margaret had responded, "I'll tell everyone we helped. It will make us look good, and it won't hurt you. Just don't correct anyone." It was like a punch to my chest. Worse, Daniel had replied, "Fine. But don't exaggerate." And her response, "I'll say what I want." My hands shook as I scrolled. Because there it was, proof that they had planned the narrative. Proof that Daniel had known. Proof that I had been manipulated. I sat there for a long moment, absorbing it. My husband had allowed his parents to rewrite our life story. He had let them undermine me, publicly and repeatedly. He had chosen silence over truth. And he had never told me. The sense of betrayal was slow, deep, and quiet. Not dramatic. Not fiery. Just a steady, hollow ache spreading in my chest. But it wasn't the end. There was more. Buried in the email thread was a request from Margaret. "Send us a small transfer so the story sounds plausible." My breath caught. That small suspicious transfer. The one I saw on the bank statement. Daniel had sent them money, not because they needed it, but because Margaret wanted evidence, in case anyone questioned their lie. They had essentially manufactured proof to support their false narrative. It was astonishing. Arrogant. Cruel. And then came the final blow, a later email from Margaret bragging to someone else, CC'd accidentally, that she had saved Daniel from living under his wife's financial mismanagement. My financial mismanagement. Me, who had budgeted for years. Me, who had organized every tax return, every bill, every investment. Me, who had sacrificed vacations and luxuries to save every possible cent. I felt the burn of humiliation sweep through me. I closed the laptop. I folded my hands. I breathed. Then I made a decision. Not vengeful. Not angry. Clear. Crystal clear. If Margaret and Howard wanted to build their identity on lies, then I would dismantle those lies with nothing but the truth. Calmly. Logically. Documented. I gathered everything, the mortgage records, the bank statements, the email printouts, and created a single comprehensive folder labeled "The Truth About Our Home." Then I sat back and looked at it. It felt like holding a shield. An ethical, undeniable shield. And I knew the time for confrontation was nearing. But the confrontation would not start with Margaret and Howard, it would start with Daniel, and the conversation that followed nearly ended our marriage. Daniel came home that evening looking tired, but when he saw the folder on the table, he froze. "What's that?" he asked. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw accusations. I simply slid the folder toward him and said, "Sit down." He hesitated before obeying. I opened the folder and laid out the documents, bank statements, mortgage papers, and finally, the printed email thread. I watched his face change as he recognized them. His eyes widened. His shoulders slumped. And then he whispered, "Elaine, you went through my emails?" "Not intentionally," I said. "They were backed up on the shared computer. I was looking for mortgage documents. But what I found was the truth." His face reddened, not with anger, but shame. "I didn't want to hurt you," he murmured. "But you did," I replied quietly. "You allowed your parents to tell the world that I was financially incompetent. That we couldn't buy our own home without their help. That you rescued me." He covered his face with his hands. "I thought it would blow over," he said. "I didn't want to start a fight with them." A sadness washed over me. "You were willing to sacrifice my reputation for their comfort." He winced. "That's not what happened." "It is," I said gently. "Maybe not intentionally. But it is." He didn't argue. I continued, "Daniel, your parents are lying. And you allowed it. You made it possible." He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. His throat worked. His eyes glistened, and for a moment I saw the boy he had once been, scared, conditioned to placate, terrified of conflict with his parents. But I couldn't let that lessen the truth. "I need you to hear me," I said softly. "This ends now." He looked up at me. "What do you want me to do?" "I want us to confront your parents together," I said. "With the facts." Calmly. Without shouting. But firmly. Daniel swallowed hard. "They'll be furious. I'm not responsible for their anger. I'm responsible for my truth." He gave a small, defeated nod. "Okay. I'll do it." There was a long pause. "And Daniel," I added, my voice steady but heavy, "if you ever hide something like this again, our marriage will not survive it." He looked gutted. "I understand," he whispered. We contacted his parents and asked to visit the following afternoon. Margaret sounded cheerful, overly so, while Howard asked, with thinly veiled curiosity, "What's this about?" "You'll see," Daniel replied. The next day, we arrived at their house. Margaret greeted us with a smug smile. Howard stayed seated, arms crossed, looking self-satisfied. I placed the folder on their coffee table. "Before anything else," I said, "I need you both to listen." Margaret's smile faltered. I opened the folder and began to lay out the truth, gently, clearly, methodically. Bank statements proving the down payment was ours. Mortgage documents with only mine and Daniel's names. Email threads revealing their fabricated narrative. Margaret's face drained of color. Howard's mouth fell open. "Elaine," Margaret stammered, "you misunderstood." "No," I interrupted quietly. "These are your words. Your statements. Your lies." Howard tried to interject. "We didn't mean." "Your intentions," I said calmly, "don't change your actions." The room was silent. Daniel finally spoke. "Mom. Dad. What you've been saying about us stops today." It was the first time I had ever heard him speak to them with real firmness. My heart ached and swelled at the same time. Margaret looked at him, eyes watery with indignation. "We only wanted to help your image." Daniel replied, "At the cost of my wife's." And for once, they had no answer. But the confrontation didn't end there, because when the truth came out, the consequences rippled through the family in ways none of us expected. The fallout began almost immediately. Margaret tried to mend the situation the way she always had, by spinning a new narrative. She told people she had been misunderstood, that the rumors were exaggerations, that I had taken things too seriously. But unfortunately for her, I had documentation. And the truth has a way of spreading once released. Word traveled quickly through the family chain. Cousins, aunts, church friends. Each person who had ever heard the false story now heard the corrected version, calmly, factually, without embellishment. Not from me, but from Daniel. He insisted on it. He took responsibility. He told them, my parents lied. Elaine and I paid for our home ourselves. I allowed the misinformation to continue longer than I should have. I'm correcting it now. It was one of the most painful and honorable things I'd ever seen him do. The responses varied. Some relatives apologized to me directly. Some were stunned. Some admitted that they had suspected something was wrong because Margaret's story had grown increasingly exaggerated. But the most surprising reaction came from within Margaret and Howard's own inner circle. Their pastor, whom they admired deeply, called them in for a private conversation. Several longtime friends confronted them for lying. Their reputation, carefully polished for decades, began to crack. Margaret stopped attending church for 3 weeks. Howard avoided phone calls. Their carefully curated image was unraveling. And for the first time in years, they showed real humility, quiet, avoidant, almost ashamed. But the consequence that weighed heaviest was the quiet tension between Daniel and his parents. Their relationship did not break, but it changed. Permanently. He was no longer willing to be their obedient son. He set boundaries. He insisted on truth. He refused to permit even the smallest embellishment. And they treated me differently too. Not warmly. Not lovingly. But with respect. Earned, not gifted. As for me, the aftermath was strangely peaceful. Not triumphant. Not vindictive. Just peaceful. Because I hadn't sought revenge. I had sought truth. And truth, once revealed, did what it always does, it set things right. Still, one final moment of consequence arrived weeks later, a moment that sealed the lesson for everyone involved. Margaret came to our door one morning, unannounced but subdued. Her makeup was minimal. Her posture smaller. She handed me a simple envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. No grand apology. Just this. I am learning the difference between appearing good and being good. Thank you for showing me the truth. I closed the envelope. I nodded once. No anger. No bitterness. Just closure. But the story doesn't end with consequences, it ends with reflection, healing, and a message I needed to share with anyone who has ever been rewritten by someone else's lies. In the quiet that followed the storm, I found myself returning to the routines I had once cherished, my chamomile tea, my garden, my evening view of the sea. But I was not the same woman I had been before all of this. I had always believed myself to be calm, patient, humble. And I had confused humility with silence, patience with self-erasure. I thought avoiding confrontation made me wise. But I learned something vital: truth does not need to shout, but it does need to be spoken. I often replayed the journey in my mind. The gossip. The humiliation. The investigation. The confrontation. The consequences. And I realized something beautiful had emerged. My voice. At 63 years old, I discovered a strength I didn't know I possessed, the strength to defend my own reality, even when others tried to rewrite it. And I realized another truth: ethical revenge is simply the restoration of honesty in a world that often rewards deception. I didn't destroy my in-laws. I didn't humiliate them. I didn't retaliate with lies or cruelty. I simply held up a mirror. And they were forced to look. Daniel and I rebuilt trust slowly, through communication, therapy, and boundaries carved in firm, steady lines. Our marriage did not break. In many ways, it grew stronger because of what we faced. My in-laws? They learned that reputation built on fiction is fragile. And truth, calm, documented, undeniable truth, has the power to humble even the proudest of people. If I could speak to anyone listening now, I would say this. Do not let anyone rewrite your story. Do not let others diminish your worth to elevate their own. And if someone tries, meet them with calm, factual truth. Not for vengeance. Not for pride. But for peace. Thank you for listening to my story. And now, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever had someone twist your truth or take credit for your hard work? Share your story in the comments. I read every one, and your voice deserves to be heard too.